And we'll get started. So welcome everybody to Happiness in Humans Live. I know there's a few familiar faces and some returning faces from a long time and then some new people. So just wanted to quickly, usually we start off with some introductions. I'm gonna skip past that today and we're gonna go into a poll. We've got Dr.Anne Hsu today from Diplomacy Dojo. She's a founder of the organization and also a lecturer on is it AI and psychology at Queen Mary University?
Yep.
Great. Yep. So I'm just going to start off with a poll for everybody. Or maybe not. I'm not sure what's going on. Caroline, I might have to ask you to launch the poll. I think it's not giving me permissions, and I think we're both logged into the same account.
Oh, okay.
Do you have the option to click polls at the bottom?
No.
No?
No.
That's strange. Okay. It was just working a second ago and now it's not. So I'm just going to pop the question in the chat and we'll have everybody answer that way. Sorry about that. Not sure what's going on there. This is my first time doing polls on Happiness in Humans Live, by the way. So of course it's not the greatest start. So the first question is, it's kind of a scenario-based question. So you have an employee who also manages others, who often displays outward negative emotions. They roll their eyes, sigh, and raise their voice regularly in response to unwelcome news. And you can see that they're making others uncomfortable. So out of these responses, it would just be interesting to hear how you would respond to that. If you would feel comfortable, if you would stay silent, or if you would actually know how to approach that situation and have a direct and diplomatic conversation.
And do you want us to write the answer in the chat?
Go ahead and write the answer in the chat, or if you'd like to just say it out loud as well, you're welcome to do that as well.
I'd say I'd hope I'd know how to say something quite direct and diplomatic. I mean, something that does come up from time to time, especially in our kind of like sales function, because it's quite heated. There's like discussions of targets and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But I still think with an HR perspective, I say something, but as an internal person, I always worry that people get offended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank
Sophie,
you,
what would you say? What's an example of something you would say in that situation?
So I'm just going back to the question. So they roll their eyes, sigh, and use their voice. I think something that I've tried to maybe in the actual moment is to give other people space and just to think about other people that are in the room and how you respond. But I think it's something that I'd take out of a group scenario and situation. And we're doing quite a lot of work now around communication, how to work with compassion with your colleagues, and all about tone through different mediums of communication as well. So I think probably in the moment I try and calm down the situation and try and make sure everyone has a voice, and equally, give a voice to whoever that is being displayed towards, but then take it out of the group discussion and maybe have a direct conversation with that person as well.
Thanks, Sophie. So that was a good start to the conversation. So as most of you know, when you've decided to tune into the webinar today, Anne is going to be talking us through how she's kind of used her background in psychology and AI to help facilitate and master difficult conversations and having more constructive conversations around feedback. So I'd like to start off with just, Anne, if you could give us a bit of background on how you've come to be interested in this kind of stuff and what you do.
So I started with a PhD in neuroscience, and so I was applying like AI models to the brain and how it worked. But I realized that really what I'm interested in is like helping people live better in their everyday life. And while there is a little bit of neuroscience, well, there's a lot of fascinating neuroscience that can tell us how to live better. That's only a very, very small subset of neuroscience research. And really we need to draw on like psychology from so many different levels. Like we need clinical psychology and social psychology and motivational psychology and well-being psychology. And so basically, I'm just obsessed with everything related to psychology. And if people say like, oh, you know, I'm having a problem with this or motivation or well-being or this relationship, I like can't help but just want to like help and listen and get into that. So I just love everything to do with psychology, and basically AI is like my background in terms of education and training. So.
And you are founder of a business called Diplomacy Dojo. Could you explain to us what that's all about?
Yeah, so I got trained as a workplace mediator, and also when I was helping do a lot of coaching for people in the workplace, I just realized a huge part of workplace stress comes from the relationships, and most of us are not taught in school to speak in a way that's effective. I think maybe a lot of you working in HR can be very good at it. You know, we learn over time in management roles, but for a lot of people, it's just not natural at all. They're thrown into management roles, or even just as an employee, having to deal with such differences in the workplace. And in the workplace has conflict inherently built into it. And it's a good thing, right? We want differences. We want to have productive conflict, to talk about differences, to have such diversity of people and roles. And of course, it's a competitive environment, right? Because you are competing for scarce resources. It's a busy time. You're always trying to innovate, always trying to improve, get a lot of things done. So of course, you know, difficult conversations and different personalities are going to come into play at work. And most of us aren't equipped to handle this effectively. You know, there's always a constructive way to talk about something in a way that preserves goodwill, where you can be clear and direct about what you mean, but nothing personal, nothing, you know, judgmental or blaming. You can just say it in a very constructive, positive way that builds a relationship. Like even something that seems like conflict can be an opportunity to build understanding in relationships. And it's really just also recognizing that this was just a skill. You know, I mean, it's hard. Some parts of psychology are really hard to address like in depth, right? If you have childhood trauma, if you have like, you know, a lot of like difficult things, that takes a long time. You can't really just use technology and just hope it'll be better. But in terms of workplace communication, this is not it's a more of a low-hanging fruit, really. There's just so much benefit that can come from just a little bit of training, right? And also the thing is with traditional training, it happens usually in a one-off workshop, and then it's just such a different thing to apply it in real life, in the real moment. Because in the real moments, you know, you don't have the words, you're not used to it, you're not used to thinking that way, your emotions might be high, their emotions you're afraid of triggering negative emotions. And really with learning anything significant, you have to repeat it over and over in realistic situations over an extended period of time. That's the only way our brains can change, right? It's like there's like so much research, and we can never change unless it's like we repeat learning over and over in realistic situations where stakes are real. And so that's the difficulty, you know, we don't have when we come up with a workplace conversation, no matter how small or big a feedback opportunity. The training was like that day, you know, months ago, right? And most of us don't have like a coach every week to say like, oh, say this, you know, and help us slowly learn this. So it's quite a different skill, but then it's still something I think everyone can learn. It's so achievable, and yet it takes practice. You know, it actually new communication styles especially for feedback and difficult communication at work it takes practice. It's not something that we just learn and okay, now we know how to do it.
And so you use AI to help support people in learning how to have those conversations. Could you, I'm not super familiar with, I know like top line level AI stuff, but could you explain if anybody else in the call, not sure how familiar everybody else is with it, but if you could explain to us what AI is and kind of how that comes into play.
Yeah, so AI is basically algorithms that can help us understand patterns in data. So without something to help us realize what's useful inside data is just noise, right? So then AI helps us recognize what parts of the data happen together in a useful pattern. So it could be recognizing the sound frequencies that make up your voice, the shapes on your face that make up your unique face. It can detect what patterns in advertising leads to clicks. And in language, it can detect what types of words and phrases convey certain ideas. So that's kind of what these algorithms are, finding patterns.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so my next question for you was, what are some of, you're using AI to help master conversations, and outside of just that, using that AI and that technology, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen that people have made while having difficult conversations and sharing constructive feedback?
Yeah, I think there are three biggest mistakes come to mind. So the first one is just kind of using characterizing language. I mean, we use judgments and characterizations just naturally to get by life, you know, and that's just what we need to do. So it's not like it's wrong. But when you're giving feedback or having a difficult conversation, often it's highly unuseful, right? Because they could perceive it as criticism. They could perceive it as like a social judgment. I mean, I've had so many people tell me like, oh, I got feedback saying I was like not, didn't have enough gravitas, or I didn't, you know, I was lacked urgency, you know, and these are kind of like vague feelings that the person giving feedback was describing from, and they might not have meant badly, they could have meant well, right? But then the person receiving this feedback that was vague now sounds characterizing of like their own person, right? And they're so frustrated, right? They get really upset and they don't know how to address it. They don't know what it means. So that's definitely one thing, that you use this subjective, vague language. We're not really, we don't automatically know how to describe things objectively, right? We don't have to do that in other parts of life. So instead, someone could have said, oh, you know, other people have talked to me about their career progression, and you haven't mentioned it once in any of our one-on-ones, right? So maybe that's what the boss meant when they got that feedback. But it requires a clarity of thinking, and also realizing that, you know, you're being vague.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I just wanted to quickly share in our group chat down here too, and you have a lot of great videos on your site that give advice on how to have constructive conversations and help support people in that. So there's a really great video there if anybody wants to check it out after the webinar, and there's a few others as well on your YouTube channel that kind of go more in depth on certain scenario-based conversations. So my next thing that I wanted to bring up is I had a look around your site, and there's some really cool interactive stuff on there, which I'll share that in the group chat in a second too. But one of the stats I saw was 9 out of 10 managers avoid constructive feedback for fear of negative reactions from employees. And that's a stat taken from Leadership IQ. And so I think that's shocking that 9 out of 10 have said that. And I just wanted to ask you, what are some ways that we can work on lowering this statistic and create more open and trusting feedback cultures?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I think one of the biggest things is to realize that it's a positive thing. You know, you're connecting with someone, you're trying to help them and the environment improve. And instead of thinking of it like, oh no, we're going to say something that's critical, we're not criticizing them. You know, we're just explaining that, oh, you know, this behavior or this thing happened, has these consequences in this current environment, and I want to you know, explain and have a dialogue together so that we know how to make things better. And I think so one of the things we highlight in Diplomacy Dojo is the use of aspirations, and to use that to frame your feedback. I mean, sometimes you just have it in your head and it'll come out naturally, but also to explicitly say that, you know, I want to make sure I'm engaged with what you say, or I want to make sure that others can engage the best with what you say, you know. And maybe sometimes when you use the words, or you don't elaborate on their questions, then people will feel that, you know, they weren't heard, and so then they won't engage as well with your ideas. So I think it's really the ability to frame. I think all feedback has the potential to be framed constructively and positively if people understand the aspirations of the values and needs underlying the feedback.
Okay, so setting up, like when you're starting up having that conversation, setting the stage with saying, this is what I want out of the conversation, and starting it off that way rather than just going right into it.
Yeah, I think that would help. Also, absolutely like that. And also, before you have the conversation inside yourself, recognize that this is your trying to express these positive values.
That's really good advice. And so another thing that I noticed on your site is that there's a highlight on judgments and feelings when you're going into a conversation. And I thought that was so interesting. So it'd be great if you could explain to everybody else why that's important, and what that means between the judgment and feelings part of it.
Yeah, I think this thing in everyday language, we've started using the words I feel to introduce things that are not core emotions. So we often say like, well, I just feel you're not listening to me. I feel that, that plan doesn't make sense. I feel, or you can say I feel belittled or I feel left out. But all of these things are interpretations of outside world. And when we say those things, we're actually assuming something that we aren't sure of. And these things are the things that are more likely to trigger someone else, right? So if it's just something harmless, then they could argue with you like, oh, you could just sound wishy-washy. But if it's something where it's actually making an interpretation of what someone else was doing, like their intention, or, they're like, I was listening to you, or no, I wasn't ignoring you. I didn't leave you out. This was just, it's once you get into this land of interpretation and what people meant, like that's no good. That's distracting from the root of what you want to address, which is just understanding, right? Oh, maybe I didn't need to be at that meeting, or maybe whatever it was, right? To get to the clarity, it doesn't help like, did you intend to leave me out or not? That's not really, it distracts from the issue. And so judgments are things that we often think of as feelings because they are they involve feelings, right? Like when we feel misunderstood, we associate that with a feeling, so in our experience, we might think, well, misunderstood is a feeling, but misunderstood involves interpreting what someone else did. And it may or may not be right. This has nothing to do with maybe they didn't understand you. That's totally possible. But the point is, it's not very helpful. A lot of times, it can be triggering if you say to someone like, well, it was very belittling when you did this, or so that's the distinction.
Can I jump in there, Rosie?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, and it's great to be back again. Thanks for sharing the invite again, Rosie. So, hi, I'm Becky. I was just reflecting on what you say there, and it's really interesting. And I'm very passionate equally about everything that you're talking about. So, thanks for sharing your experiences with us today. Picking up on that point particularly, because actually it's a real bugbear of mine as well, that I've actually had numerous conversations with various different coaches and external third-party consultants who kind of come in and talk about best practice around feedback, because it's such a fundamental topic that we're talking about here, that regardless of the level of seniority in which you operate, or regardless of the industry in which you work, allowing people to have really honest conversations and equipping people to have the confidence and the ability to do so, drives engagement, drives performance, drives a diverse and inclusive environment, and we're all trying to achieve those things. So these skills just continue to evade us, so we're continuously trying to kind of put in place practices to do that. And I think I equally started off with a point around certainly the school of thought that I was taught through various trainings, through Mind Gym, for example, is a very large training provider internationally. They originally would talk about, don't bring yourself into the equation, because I agree. I think it shouldn't be about you, it should be about the other person. I think that was a starting point. That said, actually I've tried to change my mind somewhat, actually, because further iterations of numerous conversations that I've had with many people, actually, because I haven't quite found the bottom of this, but actually I think the school of thought now that I've picked up on is that although it's not about you, conversely, I think people can argue less when it is about how you feel versus what they're saying. So I think you're right in the semantics should be aligned. So it shouldn't be that, if you're talking about observations or you're talking about judgments or versus feelings. So I agree that sometimes there's a lot of misalignment in kind of actually how people are articulating themselves. But I actually think the principle now of being able to say, well, in that meeting, I observed, and it gave the impression to me that you weren't interested, for example, if you were yawning, Greg had that recently, I saw you yawning in the meeting and it gave the impression you weren't interested. can I understand what's going on? Were you tired or had a late night? And they might say, well, no, actually, I'm just multitasking, and actually I'm really busy with something else that came in. You know, they might disagree with the judgment that I've made, but they can't disagree with the observation, and they can't disagree with the fact that actually that's the impression it gave me, because it did give me that impression. So actually, I think that's why the other school of thought is, actually, if you're saying, well, that is the impression it left you, as long as it's not saying, as you say, I felt that you weren't interested, because it's not actually a feeling, it's an observation and a judgment. But if I did say, well, you left the impression with me that you know, or you left the impression with others that you weren't interested in, you know, that team member who was talking at the time, that's actually what's now being encouraged as best practice, actually, in terms of giving feedback.
I definitely agree. Yeah. No, thank you for bringing up that's I completely agree. So I think there's a huge difference, actually, I think, between just that word impression, you know, because there you're owning the fact that you're interpreting that, right? And that's fine. You know, we have interpretations. Whereas when you say, I feel, it sounds a bit more like, I think you are, and that's the truth, right? And when you say impression, and I absolutely agree, and we have to discuss these things, right? Because this is how else we're going to know, like, how everything's coming across. And so, yeah, I do think, and I think absolutely, like, and I think it can be appropriate to say how you feel, if it's how you feel, you know, like, oh, actually, I felt upset when I got the report late because I wanted to be able to do an excellent job, and now I had to stay up till 2 a.m. You know, that's fine, right? Because you can't argue with, like you said, you can't argue with your impressions, because you're just saying, you're owning the fact that's an impression, and you're owning the fact that, well, I did have a negative feeling because of these objective things. And so, yeah, no, absolutely agree. And it's all about distinguishing them so that other people have the room, right? Because once you say, I interpret that, it's my impression, you're giving them the room to say, like, oh, but what I meant was this. That's what the word impression is allowing them. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Thanks, Rebecca, for bringing that up. And thanks, Anne, for your input on that. It's a really interesting conversation, and just wording, the way you're wording things too, when you're approaching a conversation, being so mindful of what words you're using is got to be really important in your mind. I wanted to ask you, Anne, about when you're considering emotions in conversations. That's something that's really important as well. And so could you explain to us, from your neuroscience and psychology background perspective, why they're so important when we're mastering those difficult conversations?
I think they're important from two levels. I think, first of all, beforehand to yourself, when you're talking to yourself, I think, research shows that if you label your emotions, like you can put a word to it, even the more specific and apt it is, the better. It actually calms your brain down. You know, it gives you solace and self-empathy to say, like, I'm just feeling really, I don't know, melancholy, whatever it is, you know, and that just using the word that maps well and helps you yourself digest the feeling, helps you calm your brain down, and allows you to think more clearly about the situation. And so a lot of Diplomacy Dojo is built on nonviolent communication. I don't know if a lot of people here have read that book, but it's a conflict resolution book. And the idea is that behind all of our negative feelings and positive feelings are some basic needs that were met or not met. And so it's kind of a window into your needs and values, right? So it's like, I'm melancholy because I needed, or maybe melancholy is not necessarily a bad emotion, but like, you know, I was upset because I needed clarity, I needed safety, I needed consideration, and these things. And so I think, we have a post on expressing emotions, and also Diplomacy Dojo is designed to detect when you talk about emotions, if you talk about it in ways that attribute the emotions to unmet needs, so that you can, instead of saying, like, you did this and I felt angry, you say, well, you did this, I felt angry because I wanted, you know, I wanted to do a good job, or I wanted also to be heard, or what, you know, whatever. So then the attention is put towards the aspiration,
right?
Not just like, oh, you made me angry. You know?
And so that's where the AI would come in, when you're kind of writing out that sentence and understanding that second part of it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put in the group chat here the link to your site if anybody wants to check out kind of the interactive stuff that you have on there. So something at the Happiness Index, we underpin all of our programs with neuroscience in mind. And I was wondering if you use any of the learnings that you've gotten from neuroscience to address how we have conversations, and that you might be speaking to someone who is very instinctive or somebody who's really reflective. Is that something that you kind of consider when having conversations at all?
So right now it's not adjusted for necessarily different conversation styles. It's more just like the best practice for not triggering the social threat center. So as probably everyone is, right, like we do have part of our brain that just recognize anything to do with ourselves, and ourselves is not necessarily bad, but the moment like anything to do with ourselves is linked with something slightly negative, then all of a sudden it's like, you know, fight and
it's
flight.
like that fight or flight mode, right, where you're trying to get into a safe mentality, or using a lot of that energy to put yourself into a spot where you can feel safe, and if you don't have that, then it's bye-bye, that flight mode.
Exactly. You know, I say it's often it's like trying to talk to someone while you're throwing like mini grenades into their living room at the same time. You know, so they're not going to be paying attention to you. But there's another really interesting piece of research, which I talk about in one of my videos, is that there's research that shows if you get primed with caring images, and so in the research they just showed photos of strangers that were like hugging each other or caring for each other, etc. It actually reduced the threat response. So just the coming with the approach that like, oh, you know, I care and I want things to be good, and you know, I'm not here to like bring negativity. I'm here just with the caring attitude and frame. That makes a huge difference. It goes such a long way.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like also just being more comfortable with sharing, being caring like that, and being empathetic, bringing that into the conversation is so much better than trying to hide any kind of emotion, or trying to have a stone face, or you know. That's really interesting. What is some of the most interesting research that you found out of going through understanding how people have conversations? Is there some kind of really interesting fact that you found?
Gosh,
It's
I mean,
a tough question. I know you've probably done a lot.
There's so many. I guess one of the things off the top of my mind, which I talked to you about, which is like how little we understand each other. And so there's research showing, like looking at, they took friends, they took acquaintances, they took long-term couples, and they had them undergo a conversation. They had a two-way conversation about some important topic. And then later, they would ask each of them individually, like at this point, what did the person mean? What did they think? What were they feeling? And then they cataloged how often they were correct about what they were listening to each other about. And like for long-term couples, like 20 years together, they were talking about their most talked about issue, like their most, you know, like whether it's contentious or the thing that, you know, like they talk about the most, they were only correct in what the other person meant 50% of the time. Wow. So this is like 20-year-old couples, and they're talking about their most talked about issue, and still half the time they didn't get each other accurately when they were, and then it just goes down from there, you know, for like friends or people who are just acquaintances, only 20% of the time did they get it accurate. So that means 80% of the time. And it wasn't like they were being ultra picky about, did you understand the other person? It was just, they had separate researchers coding whether they were accurate and just thinking what the other person was saying. And so vaguely, if it was in the ballpark, they would say it was right, you know? So like 80% of the time, they just were completely off the mark. And I think it just really highlights the importance of over communicating. Like, you know, just, and often like with working on this stuff, people will say, well, it's just so much longer to say, you know, well, when you didn't put the dishes back in the sink, and or this was left, you know, or the report came in 20 hours late, you know, with some spelling mistakes here, and the paragraphs didn't transition well. That's so much longer than saying, oh, you were sloppy, right? Like that takes so much longer, but it just saves time in the long run to really lay things out in objective, you know, well-meaning ways. And also, like, if you communicate emotions and your interpretations, to be careful about owning those things. And that time spent is time saved, you know.
Definitely. Robin, you had your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for all your information. It's fascinating to hear. I think just a note on that, I don't know, you must have all heard of Brene Brown. Like, absolutely love her. She's like the queen of everything. And she talks about that lack of communication. I think, I don't know whether you've seen her talk on Netflix. I think it's like a documentary, but she talks about, I think she was swimming, she went on holiday with a partner, and sorry for those that have actually like listened to it before, and I don't think I'm going to do it very much justice, but I'll go and try. So and they're both swimming, her and her husband, and she just feels like at peace and like just really overwhelmed with like joy and love, and she just like, and she says to her husband like, I feel so like I love you the most at this point, like I just I feel so content. You know, the kids are over there playing, like we're on holiday, you know, and he replies just with a really short phrase, just like, yeah, okay, like not like I love you too, or like meeting her where she's at. And she was like, are you joking? Like, are you actually kidding me right now? Like, I couldn't be any more expressive with what I'm saying. And like, obviously she was expecting this, you know, again, it goes back to expectations, but also trying to be met with that. And so she's like, what is going on with you? And she says it again, thinking, right, did he not hear me? Like, what, you know? And she's like, look, darling, like I couldn't be any more content, and I love you in this moment. Like, look at, you know, we've got everything, it's fabulous. And he just says it again. He's just like, yeah, okay, like, and she's like, what is happening? She says that in that moment, the narrative in her head and the story she was telling herself was like, right, what's going on? He obviously clearly doesn't love me. What, he's seen someone else, you know, all of this. Mm-hmm. So she got out of the lake in obviously livid, and she goes back to the house and she's like banging about, you know, with the dishes and stuff. And she's just like, and she went and got changed, and he came into the room and she's like, what is going on for you? Like, did you not hear what I just said? And he's like, Dan, I did. But I also in that moment was trying to steer off a panic attack. But he was swimming, but trying to like stay really calm. It's like in that moment, I couldn't tell you what you wanted to say and what you wanted to hear. Of course, I love you. But in that moment, all I could think about was just the safety of getting out, you know? And so it's like, wow, the narrative, the story we tell ourselves is, and it can go, and it just translates into the workplace as well. You know, you can sort of be thinking, why are they being like that? What is going on? And because the response is different to what you could have all the best intentions, of course, but whatever's going on in their head at that moment, you know, is the opposite.
Definitely. It's such a key story, like what you told, because so often we're talking and we have different meanings. Like his was about safety. His was about, you know, just staying calm, not losing it. And hers was like, oh, I have all the resources to like enjoy my love and like appreciation right now. And yeah, it's just so hard. I mean, I don't know if you guys know, Esther Perel is a quite famous relationship psychologist, and she has a great podcast called How's Work Now. So it's now just is on work relationships. Mm-hmm. And she's mentioned that one of the things she's like, emotional intelligence is the ability to hold two different points of view at the same time.
Hold two.
And it sounds
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Say that again, Anne. I'm just
to hold two different viewpoints at the same time.
Okay.
And in a way, it sounds like not very hard if you're just thinking about like, oh, you know, some people like this and some people like that, you know, but it's not like that when it comes to something emotional and something in the moment when it's quite charged situation. And that's very hard to hold two points of view, right? And that's exactly, you know, Robin's story just highlighted that.
Right. So go ahead, Robin, go ahead.
Just a quick note on that. And this is a little bit separate but similar, do you feel like, you know, you talk about conflict resolution and like going through like positive emotional language or like positive language to get out of that, do you feel like there should be an element of being able to express and emotions, able to that to, you know, I think it's healthy to have healthy dialogue. I don't know whether I'm expressing it right, but you know, like healthy debate, should I say? You know, I don't know whether always putting a positive spin on things is the right way, or it might, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of following on what Rebecca brought up. So you cut out a little bit, sorry. So if I don't 100%, just let me know if I'm missing something you said, because it cut out and I couldn't hear everything. But it's definitely not just about being like cheery and positive about everything at all, you know? And I think definitely negative emotions happen, bad consequences happen as a result of people's actions. And it's absolutely important to have those aired out, right? And so that's why, you know, in terms of emotions in the workplace and expressing emotions in the workplace, I mean, sometimes it's very important. It's important for authenticity. It's important for people to feel heard, you know, just that someone can say, I feel really angry, and to have someone else say like, okay, you know, and that's okay, you know, just to allow like someone's emotional space. One of the best things you can do for someone is just to sit in their emotional space with them and accept that with them. You know, that's one of the like the kindest, most like generous things, and the receiver, you know, just is the biggest gift to them, and we don't even realize, you know, because it's something so simple in a way, because we want to fix it, or we want to say like, no, you shouldn't do that, or maybe okay, you know, or empathize and just like blame someone else. But really just to be like, oh my gosh, that must feel so infuriating, and then just be there with them in that. And often in mediation, one of the main things, like, oh, you know, 80% of it, whatever, you know, is just that people just want to feel heard, and feeling heard means that you hear their feelings and needs, you know, and what they needed in that moment. And I think the really big thing is, when you're talking about negative emotions, to really get away from the positions. Like, it's great to like own up your interpretations and, you know, your impressions, and then just have that to increase the dialogue and to hear like, oh, you know, this is, you know, I did have this impression. And also just to go down to what's deeper, which is like, you know, what I really needed was that safety. What I wanted was, you know, celebration of our love, you know, whatever in your story. And to get to that level where we all can talk about our universal needs and values. And this is the empathy bridge. That's where you can, you know, have room to see the other person's perspectives. Like, oh, you know, oh, I see you were worried about your safety. Like, even, you know, even if someone loses at work, you're like, oh my God, what a jerk. You know, he just like shouted. But, you know, he's worried about their safety. You know, the person could have been worried about their safety. They could have been worried about their stress. You know, they could have not slept for nights, you know, all these things. And so absolutely, it's not about being like very, you know, airy-fairy and positive at all. I just meant a positive frame doesn't mean you're only talking about positive things or positive emotions, you know, absolutely, you know, and I think that's the thing. It'd be amazing if everyone learned to talk about negative emotions in a way that was constructive, you know, where they could point to the underlying needs under their negative emotions and focus on that, not focus on, you know, these external, like, it's because I think, you know, this and that. It's like, oh no, because what I really needed was to have an understanding of what to prioritize. And it was so frustrating that I was doing, you know, this instead of that, or an acknowledgement that I was doing 2 jobs, whatever it was, you know.
I suppose in that moment though, sorry Rose, I'm chatting away, aren't I?
It's okay, don't worry. I'm actually happy for everybody to ask questions at this point. I mean, we've got the hour left, so go ahead.
In those moments, I suppose it's hard to rationalize, because, you know, it's a response, isn't it? Everyone responds to things differently. So that sort of, like you were just saying, you know, holding space for them just to be exactly as they are, in whatever state that may be, is really important. So yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so much of it is about vocabulary as well, because we don't go around thinking about our essential needs, you know, like if I feel off during the day, I don't think just, oh, like I just need some enlivenment, or I need some consolation, or I need some, you know, these are not the way, that's not the level on which we're thinking most of the time. But if we gain the vocabulary, being more aware of that and having that more accessible, we can bring that to our conversations in the moment more readily as well. But then it's easier, you know, when someone's being a certain way, or you're feeling a certain way, it's like, okay, well, I'm just needing this. And because, you know, imagine if Brene Brown's partner was able to be like, I'm just needing safety right now, you know, so if you could say in the moment, it could save her hours of her life.
Slamming some cabinet doors.
Save some cabinet doors, yeah.
Watch all the things you can, but I suppose in those moments of feeling quite heightened, whether it be anxiety, stress, anger, it doesn't matter how much you know, the tools and knowledge, sometimes it overtakes all of that.
Yeah.
So it's just providing space, I think, to just go, just be as you are, but in a safe environment, so it's not like, you know, people are getting hurt and injured and stuff. So
yeah. I agree with that, definitely.
Sorry, I'll stop now. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Well, so we have this booked out until the end of the hour. So if anybody else has any questions, this is a good time to ask them to Anne. Otherwise, I can let you go. Any questions, anybody?
Just to say thanks, that's really interesting. I'm going to check out your videos and the site. Yeah, I've probably got millions of questions, but I can't think of any right now. Oh, actually, what was your answer in terms of how you'd react to that first question that Rosie put on?
Let me remind myself. Oh, I think just I want people to be comfortable having, you know, people might feel uncomfortable because they want to discuss what went wrong in a calm way, you know. So when you raise your eyes and sigh, yeah, they might get uncomfortable because they want a calm discussion. So just pointing to what they're wanting.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if any of you want to like chat more about this, like I love it. I'm just obsessed with this stuff, so just get in touch. You know, you can email me at either Diplomacy Dojo or at my university email address, either one.
Are you happy for me to share your contact details, Anne?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. And what we plan to do on the site is to like release just some mini challenges or courses like kind of the scenario that Rosie posted, you know, like what would you say, and you can practice it out on the site, or just even like go with each other, and we can release like, oh, you know, these are things that people think are useful to say. So yeah, sign up or just get in touch. And yeah.
Great. Yeah, there is some cool interactive stuff on your site, which I posted in the chat, but also to share onto my community update later today. Thank you, Anne, for coming on Happiness in Humans. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. And then next, Happiness in Humans, we are going to be doing a little bit of an interactive one. So it's going to be more about mindfulness and kind of tools that we can use to practice throughout our day. So I'll send out more details around that in my update as well. But thanks, everybody. I'll let you get on with your days and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Anne, Rosie.
Thank you.
Cheers.